Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the third lecture of the day. My name is Ju-Won Im, an assistant professor of landscape architecture. We will have time for a few questions at the end of the lecture. So please send your questions to me, Ju-Won Im, in the chat. It's on the lower right corner of your screen. So now let me introduce our speaker. Sara Zewde is founding principal of Studio Zewde, a design firm in New York City participating landscape architecture, urbanism, and public art. The studio is devoted to exploring the aesthetics of being and creating enduring places where people belong. The firm was recently named a 2021 Emerging Voice by the Architectural League of New York. In parallel with practice, Sara serves as assistant professor of practice at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Sara was named the 2014 National Olmsted Scholar by the Landscape Architecture Foundation, a 2016 Artist in Residence at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, and in 2018 was named to the National Trust for Historic Preservation's inaugural 40 Under 40 list. Most recently, she was named a 2020 United States Artist Fellow. Sara holds a Master's of Landscape Architecture degree from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, a Master's of City Planning from MIT, and a BA in Sociology and Statistics from Boston University. Please help me welcome Sara Zewde. Sara.
Thank you for that welcome. Thank you to all the faculty and students and staff that made this event happen and the incredible conversations that you've curated. And it's just an important and timely set of dialogues to be having right now. And I'm honored to be invited to be part of it. I'm big fans of a number of your faculty members. So, it's too bad that it's not in person, but I appreciate the efforts to continue making this space despite everything. So with that, I will jump right in and share a little bit about the work that I do and the reflections that I have and on it and in view of the kind of brief of the symposium. A little bit about myself. I grew up in a town called Slidell, Louisiana. And it was 2005, August 29, 2005, when I watched this storm event brew and barrel towards my home state while I was sitting in my college dorm in Boston. And, I was a student that didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And it was really the aftermath of the event that propelled me towards trying to find a disciplinary framework for being able to intervene in the cultural, the ecological, the aesthetic, the political, the infrastructural, all of these kind of factors that manifest a Hurricane Katrina. And that became, for me, over years, a combination of city planning and landscape architecture, which is where I situate my practice now. I'm principal of a firm called Studio Zewde. We're a landscape architecture and urban design firm based in New York City in Harlem. So when the world opens up again, if you find yourself in New York, come visit us on Lenox Avenue. And the way that we talk about our work is through the use of a design methodology that really takes big ideas and inquiries and translates them into the craft of construction. That it really is. We have this sincere belief that it is at the detail scale that a lot of the expression of intentionality around design and planning is made. And so, it is how two materials come together, or the expression of material, or there's an element at that scale that also makes people feel like they belong. And we don't take that lightly. But it makes people feel like they belong, make a place feel like it belongs in its context, cultural and physical and ecological. And so we really work hard at that. We don't have a details library, for instance, in the office. The decision making around how to build the environment that we call it the built environment. We kind of take that for granted, but it's built, and those decisions are ones that we have the privilege and honor of making, right? And so this kind of methodology allows us to work across geographies, across project types, across scales. And so I wanted to share a few of those with you today. And I tried to select things that were working at different scales. I know a number of people in the audience are in different disciplines, and I wanted to kind of be able to speak to people's disciplinary interests. So this is a small project from 2013. This is before the business was formed, and I was kind of working independently, working with small firms. This was with a small firm in Houston. So this is Genesee Street, a street in a neighborhood called Freedmanstown, built by people who were recently emancipated. So they traveled from the cotton plantations along the Brazos River to Houston and settled in a particular spot on Buffalo Bayou that hadn't, despite its proximity to downtown Houston, hadn't been settled because of its clay soils and really thick vegetation. It was prone to flooding. But so this spot right here, made their own bricks, paved their own streets, cleared the vegetation, built their own homes, institutions, all things the city of Houston wouldn't support them in. And they went on to create what would be the Black civic heart of Black Houston, home to shop owners, teachers, lawyers, doctors. And over time, the neighborhood fell victim to what a number of neighborhoods in the urban core do, which is, a series of the freeway construction bisecting the neighborhood, a number of urban renewal projects, and more recently, the intense development pressure given its proximity to downtown. So I was working on the streetscape for one street in this neighborhood called Genesee Street. This was actually a project commissioned by the city to a civil engineer. We were the subs. So on the left, you kind of see the historic grain. And on the right, you see the scale of the kind of urban renewal that peppers the neighborhood. And, the civil kind of asked us to do what they imagine most landscape architects do, which is tell them where to put the trees. And, where the curb lines, trees 30 foot on center, like this, keep it simple. And, oh, maybe you could put some African pavers in the ground or something to talk about the history. And it was really, really kind of sent me on a journey of trying to push how to tell this kind of story with just a 60-foot wide right-of-way streetscape project. There's no memorial, there's no anything, and nobody commissioned that either. It wasn't part of the scope. The scope that I was given was a streetscape. So instead of a plaque or African pavers, I started to research the architecture that the original settlers built, and learned that it was basically came from the Yoruba, a West African group that brought it to Haiti during, when they were trafficked and enslaved to Haiti, and during the Haitian Revolution, a lot of people brought that architectural type as they escaped to New Orleans, and from there it basically traveled across the bayous of Southeast Texas, landed in Freedmanstown. And then a number of distinct elements about this architectural typology is that with the short end of the home, you really optimize the number of families and people that are facing each block. And so there's this incredible social dynamic and animation of every block. And with the ubiquity and alignment of the porches and the steps and the windows and doors and the minimal setback, basically non-existent setback, you basically get this kind of gallery of spaces that punctuate or blur the distinction between the private interior of the home and the public space of the street. And when you talk to people, their memories are most closely associated with this gallery of spaces between private and public. So I went and documented these structures while a number of them still remain, and really looking for the patterns embedded in this cutout doors and windows and porches and windows, and steps rather. Even looking at the paving pattern that the original settlers laid, which along the straightaway, you'll notice is this orthogonal pattern. And then in the intersections that breaks and forms a diamond. And the elders in the neighborhood talk about the intention of the original settlers, to mark the space of the intersection as a space of ritual, and that this was a tradition actually brought from West Africa. So with this little streetscape project, I proposed concentrating the salvageable bricks in the intersections, and where we were meant to include a site wall to separate the school from the street. Instead of just a site wall, I proposed a series of concrete panels with that kind of essentialized these important rhythms and patterns in the doors and windows. And the modesty of the material of concrete and the color really speaking to the modesty that the original settlers laid. So here I am modeling the patterns cast by the cutout doors and windows. I also proposed using the wood panels from the original structures that, as they come down, to use them to form the concrete so that they become a sort of grain of the original structures. And instead of just off-the-shelf site furnishings, there was an integration of offering seating into the motif of the porch and the porches. So instead of a plaque talking about the history of this place, we are prompting or provoking similar kinds of interactions that this neighborhood has borne witness to over time. So the planting palette itself, is offering shade in the Houston heat, the Texas heat. I know y'all know about that. But it's also really speaking to the bayou vegetation that the original settlers worked with and lived amidst. And so, the thing about this project then is, this is the stuff of life of if you're a landscape architect or an urban designer. It's streets, it's paving, it's vegetation, it's lighting, it's site walls, it's site furnishings, and seating and trash can. Like this is our media, and so we don't have to be asked to tell stories by virtue of memory goes here, memorial goes here. Every investment that we're making in cities is an opportunity to reveal, and if we choose not to, then that's also a statement in and of itself, right? And so it really kind of propelled me in my own work to really think about every piece of what we do as being really charged, right? So this is another project in Philadelphia that we were commissioned by the Fairmount Park Conservancy to develop a landscape design for a 22-acre portion of Fairmount Park, one of the largest urban park systems in North America. So this is our 22-acre site. It's adjacent to Strawberry Mansion, which is a neighborhood that has an incredible legacy of arts and culture and notable people and athletes, and really an incredible story of resilience. And having said that, the high school is considered one of the most dangerous high schools in the United States. There's a huge vacancy issue, unemployment. This park, though, this Mander Recreation Center and its surroundings really are the place for people to get away, represents a space of hope. There's sports there. People talk about incredible relationships with mentors and coaches and intergenerational gathering and after school programs and this and first kisses, everything happens at this park. And so one of the things that we were told coming in was that Reservoir Drive, the street here, is really a boundary between the people who live in this neighborhood, who are 98% Black, and the regional draw of some of the sports fields. And so this has become a divider line between basically Black and white. And another thing is you see the amenities, the facilities of the site are all clustered on one side of the park on the edge. And that the rec department historically in the history of Philadelphia served Black populations of Philly, and that the parks department generally had the jurisdiction of the interior of the park, and they were kind of on the other side of Reservoir. So that's the physical and social kind of context of this park. So these are the existing conditions, and when we hear people talk about the park, but then you see these images, there's a kind of disconnect between how special and remarkable this is important it is in people's minds, and the physical conditions and investments that are being made here. And so we saw our task as elevating the physical dimensions of the site to be, on par in union with the importance that this has and the value that this has in people's lives. So part of what we did, one of our first steps was, and we do this in a lot of our projects, is deep research and archival work. And we found these really incredible historic images of the site that allowed people to really open up to us and to the process and share with us why this park meant so much over time. One community member gave us this poem, and it says, "Now I have seen monuments, great geometric heaps of stone, lifeless towers raised to keep alive the dead. But I ask, cannot a monument that breathes be built?" And that really became a departure for us, a just conceptual one, how to design a monument that breathes in the form of a park. Our first community meeting, we never actually have meetings, we only have events. And we came with nothing drawn. We learned that the neighborhood has a lot of block parties. So we had a block party, and it was a celebration of the neighborhood and of the park as it is. And we had, t-shirt making, we had performers come and take the mic and perform about what they love about this park. And, we hired caterers from the neighborhood. And it actually became a site analysis tool for us too, being able to see how people use the site and, see it just highly activated. And we had these prompts around where people could share with us what it is that they love about this park. At a certain point, the 150 party goers were asked to sit at 6 tables and make a collective collage with the people at their table about what they love about this place. And that really gave us a chance for them to be in conversation with each other instead of designer and community member. Now it's community member and community member coming together to coalesce their ideas. Each group came up and shared to the rest of the group, to the larger party, their collage. And it gave us a chance to listen. We're not presenting, we didn't present anything. We just sat there and listened to how people articulate what's important. We took those 6 collages and did this interpretive analysis. Not sort of one-to-one, somebody said they want bike parking here, so we got to have bike parking there. No, but just what are the big strokes? What are the sequences and orientations that are important? And we were able to distill that into 3 themes that we used to guide our design process. One was activating this north edge all the way to the north side. 2 was bringing people into the heart of the campus, which they understand to be somewhere here, not necessarily the heart of the campus is not the river, it's not the interior of the park, but they perceive the heart to be here. And 3 was creating a clear and legible circulation system across the site that allows people to take in the range of activities that happen here. And so we were able to very clearly show from start to finish how the input actually shaped in physical space, shaped the design that we developed. We responded to the fact and anchored to the fact that the southeast corner is the social heart. There's no reason we have to shift it. We're going to fortify it, and we're going to celebrate that this is what this is how people live. This is their experience. So we working with Jigsaw Architecture, doubled the footprint of the recreation center that has so much of the educational programming and gathering space, created an expanded plaza, but oriented views from the plaza into the sports field and flexible lawn zone, and shape the topography to really hold in that heart as is understood by people, and welcoming people from the north through this kind of garden walk. The way that we resolved the question of Reservoir Drive was to offer, so you'll notice while these look like loops that form around the heart, you can't actually walk across any of these loops without engaging Reservoir Drive. So this was a small little edit, but in the end, it means a lot in the kind of diagram of the site. And in other words, to walk around the loop, you have to engage Reservoir Drive. And so we also introduced a series of crosswalks and mid-block crossings. So we're offering safe and accessible crossing across Reservoir Drive, but we're not trying to shift or change the way people experience and enjoy the park today. We developed a memory plan as well that clearly communicated to people as they shared their memories to us, ways in which not only do these investments preserve or allow them to continue these activities, but rather it's about fortifying them into the future. So we could point to specific elements of the park and say, this is about anchoring, particularly in a neighborhood where displacement is a threat. John Coltrane grew up on 33rd facing the park, and on the left is a sketch of the mathematics of jazz music that he did. And we took that and translated that into a paving pattern that was stretched across the site, which became an armature for wayfinding and for inscriptions about notable people from the neighborhood. So we heard a lot about family reunions. We did a whole grove for family reunions. You'll notice Meek Mill, who's a rapper from the neighborhood, in this rendering, which people got a kick out of. And then in the plaza, looking out at that kind of bowl that holds this flexible lawn and sports field, we proposed a water feature with inscriptions of the poem about the breathing monument, so that as you're looking out, you're able to reflect on the fact that this community itself, but is the breathing monument, and the landscape really is just framing that and offering that perspective. This is another project in Philadelphia. It's a 6-acre site. Our client is the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation. The place is called Graffiti Pier. So that graffiti, when people say Graffiti Pier, they're referring to Pier 18, but it's inclusive of Pier 20. Our site is inclusive of Pier 20. As you can kind of see here, it's a pier that's falling into the river. And then we have some of the uplands area as part of our site as well. Our initial research of the site was interesting for a few reasons. I mean, one thing we learned was that in the 1970s, as coal declined in the state of Pennsylvania, actually coincides with the invention of graffiti in Philadelphia, which they will definitely have, especially if you live in New York like I do. Graffiti was invented in Philadelphia. So in the 1970s, sites like this, which was a coal chute, Graffiti Pier was a coal chute, fell into disuse and actually fell into use, emerged into use for communities like this one, which was the street art community. So this continued to thrive as an underground street art museum until 2010, when Instagram started, and it started to emerge in, among sort of more popular culture as a really cool place to go. It is now considered the most Instagrammed place in Philadelphia. And this became a liability issue for the railroad company that owns the site. So they started to talk to our client about what would it look like if this became a publicly accessible space. So you can understand that when that conversation started to happen, the graffiti writers were upset because graffiti is a very sensitive ecosystem, and it thrives on anonymity and transgression, and people have day jobs and monikers, and they're criminalized for their use of the site, and there's a lot of cultural dimensions to graffiti that are under threat if you were to make it a public park. And so our kind of pitch to the client was to say we need to honor the fact that people are literally criminalized for this. And so instead of kind of a spectacle of community engagement, which we did to speak to adjacent residents, we would have a kind of parallel track of engagement where we are meeting with graffiti writers, off the record in a series of spaces. We would meet at bars. We got anonymous emails and phone calls. We got representatives sent to us, and to really engage people in the way that's respectful. So this is one of the venues where we met with graffiti writers. One of the first things we wanted to communicate to them was, because particularly given the sentiment that we shouldn't do anything, don't touch it, don't do landscape architecture, don't do design. We said, okay, but in the 20 to 30 years, this site is going to be inundated from just high tides, not storm event, but just daily high tides. So You do nothing, you lose this place. It's not, before we could really do our damage, is probably a bigger threat is actually climate change in this case. Not only from the seaside, but from the land side, where urban development is encroaching and getting closer and closer to the pier. So we were like, you have these two pressures coming at you. You could do nothing, sure, we could do nothing, but you miss an opportunity to actually save this place. And so we started to reframe the project as a Save Graffiti Pier project. And that really started to mobilize them to think like, oh, we got to do something, So in our conversations, we asked all these disparate conversations, we asked the same question. What is the best thing that can happen here? And what is the worst thing that can happen here? We started to map the responses. And as you can see, the best thing fell basically into the realm of untouched, and the worst thing fell into New Park. And so we kind of culled 4 kind of emerging themes from this to use as our design guidelines for the process. And those were ensuring the continuation and expansion of art, keeping the site vegetated and passive, making it safe and accessible without looking safe and accessible, and keeping it gritty. And so similarly, we were able to continue to go back to the graffiti writers and show and demonstrate how these 4 were influencing the design process itself. For instance, keeping it gritty. When we asked the graffiti writers, what does gritty mean? And we got, like rocks and mud and water and plants. And what they were describing is actually an ecosystem of that similar to the historically intertidal landscape where this site sits. And so we actually proposed removing the bulkheads and introducing an intertidal landscape to do a number of things. 1, to keep it gritty, but 2, to also help create a vegetated visual buffer around Pier 18, and 3, to actually allow the site and its program to shift upland as the tides continue to rise. And so, really working through those 4 allowed us to come to a resolution about the site plan. At a certain point in the process, we also shared early renderings with the graffiti writers, and we had them actually tag their responses and their feedback. And so we went through the process of decoding some of those tags and using that feedback to come back to the plan and the sections and integrate things like bioretention with the art and really speaking to the existing qualities of the site. We also introduced a green frame that holds visually the space as a kind of feeling like a gem, even as condos continue to get constructed closer and closer to the site. These ideas influenced our design of site furnishings, where we designed large concrete flat furnishings that look like they're part of the material history of the site or the cultural history of the site, which is artists coming out and bringing benches and so forth, and offering them as additional surfaces for art making. We looked at the archival drawings of the place and found these beautiful railings from the original 1923 structure, and actually used them to design new railings, which I'll show in a future image. We, when COVID hit, we decided to, in order to keep the dialogue going, we worked with the graffiti writers to develop a zine, which is a form of communication that they engage in. And so they would go out to the pier, write, and take photos and email us their photos. And so in a zine, we showed them the design updates. We were able to share the design updates and integrate art, their graffiti writing, into the zine. And so we would give one graffiti writer a stack of these, and then they could distribute those to their networks, and we kind of infiltrated through those means. So I'll go through a few before and after images, so you get a sense of what this kind of light touch approach to the site, what it looked like. This is before, this is after, so you see the railings and how we brought it up to code in this kind of green frame. This is before and this is after, so we're just introducing stormwater retention and or bioswale and upgraded surfacing to make this site ADA accessible. This is before, this is after, so we're just introducing some upgraded surfacing and more robust and resilient planting palette, but really using the traces of where the pioneering species are. This is before, this is after, so we're introducing a shade garden in this sort of shady pocket on the east side of the trestle, and some of our site furnishings. This is before and this is after. Site furnishings, some shade, again, a more robust planting palette. This is before, this is atop the trestle where people are climbing up to see views of the river and downtown Philly. And this is after, so what we've done is we've introduced an ADA accessible ramp cutting through the sort of concrete bed and the new railings. And they said, whatever you do up there, don't make it the High Line. So we just went simple, and it's sedums and grasses and gravel. And then on Pier 20, the pier that's currently falling into the river that's not really used today, we shored up the pier structure from a structural standpoint, but also kind of kept this idea of water flowing through. So there's marsh planting on the pier. But the way we're shoring up the structure is to actually introduce new seawalls. So now the artists have more walls that engage actually directly the high tides. And so this is after on Pier 20 with the new seawalls, marsh planting, and opportunities for art making and occupying the space. Okay, so one last project. This is a small project, but a fun one, I think. This is in Seattle, Washington, in a neighborhood called the Central District. The neighborhood was over 70% Black in the 1970s, and today it's 12%. So you can make the argument that essentially gentrification is complete. And so there's a generation of people in their 40s that witnessed the dismantling of the neighborhood and found it interesting that the adjacent community of Chinatown hadn't experienced the same levels of displacement. And they kind of had the hypothesis that in part, the name of the neighborhood having reference to the people was helpful. And so they started to call themselves Africatown. And that happened about 10 years ago that they started doing it informally. And now it's like officially kind of called Africatown in policy documents, and the mayor refers to it as such. And they formed a community land trust, and they commissioned us to work with them on some early visioning work. So we held a series of design ciphers. And it's kind of a take on the charrette, but really using the idea of a cipher that comes from hip hop as a orienting tool, a way to reformat the charrette, and form a kind of entry point for people of different ages and so forth into the process. So the design ciphers were all about asking, what does Africatown look like? If we were to build and design and develop the chapter after gentrification, that was the kind of question. What would Africatown look like? So a couple of projects came from these conversations. One was this small public art installation where we took this is a sign that, sorry, New York City is happening outside for the noises. This is a sign that's ubiquitous in the neighborhood today, right? There's all this construction, and so you see these coming soon signs and new construction, and there's a Porsche and a jogger and a dog, and it just visually doesn't track with what people know this place to be historically. So we decided to make our own coming soon signs that were fake. And it basically taking the idea of what would Africatown look like if it were built? What would it look like 100 years ago? And so we started to make these coming soon Africatown signs and putting them around the neighborhood. So you'll see like all of these logos of different companies is all fake, but they're the kinds of companies that would have to be built to build Africatown. You would need Africatown developers and Ujamaa Consulting and Obelisk Engineering and Roots Landscape Architecture. And so if you were walking around Seattle in summer of 2018, you would see all of these signs around the neighborhood. It was really fun standing out in front of these and, hearing people just kind of be like, oh my God, is this gonna happen? And, I'd have to be like, yeah, I think so, that's what it looks like. And the kind of fiction continued when you go to the website, because we just had this whole page of talking about these fake projects. And it wasn't until you go to the events panel where the events are actually the real life meetings for the Africatown Community Land Trust. So the kind of fiction is, you know, the matrix is pierced through and you're brought into the real world of like, okay, well, there's an organization that's trying to make this happen. And so it became a kind of mobilizing tool for people. People got really excited, you know, it was kind of in the press, and it had the effect that Africatown wanted, what the Community Land Trust wanted, which was to mobilize people towards asking the questions, you know, what if, what can, just the image in people's mind to move towards was helpful. Another project that came out of those design ciphers was this temporary plaza project. This parking lot is kind of the most important Black cultural landscape in Seattle, in a sense. It's considered, the papers always call it the ground zero of gentrification. It's the corner of 23rd and Union. People that are displaced will drive 2 hours to just stand in this parking lot and hang out. And this is what it looks like. You know, you wouldn't necessarily think that it represents so much, but indeed it does. The Community Land Trust purchased this property, and while they didn't have the funds to develop it in any meaningful way in the short term, they wanted to think about what a temporary activation could be to, again, to mobilize people and start to ask the question, what if, what is even possible, you know? So with 30,000 square feet to cover, we knew that paint was going to be our best friend in terms of, you know, kind of prototyping Africatown. That was the intent. We had a design cipher just around this question of, you know, what do we do with this place? And so, you know, the one thing about the corner of 23rd and Union, it's the intersection in Seattle where the most amount of Black men have been incarcerated for possession of marijuana. Now that marijuana is legal, there's a dispensary across the street that's not Black owned, and those men still largely sit in prison. So there was this question of wanting to take that corner back, and so there was this idea of outdoor living room emerged, and literally making the gesture of sit here and stay. And there was the intention from community members to use concrete, which is not a material you would think of for a temporary plaza, but the sentiment was, we want to concretize our presence in the city of Seattle. So we worked with formerly incarcerated men in the neighborhood to build this concrete living room. A number of them had never worked with concrete before, but they've actually gone on to use this skill and take on other landscape installation projects in the neighborhood. We also had over 300 people from the neighborhood come out and help paint. So we had a neighborhood block, paint the block party is what we call it. And lots of cute kids painting all day. Is really hard to narrow these down to a few. I always call this the most beautiful post office parking lot I've ever seen. This has all had to remain a functioning parking lot. There's tenants in these buildings, so we had to work with all the small businesses and businesses like the post office to, or not business, but entities like the post office to coordinate all of this. This is midway through the construction of the living room. We got some plants out there. The mayor came out for a red ribbon cutting. So this is before and this is after. We were like, oh, architecture, all of a sudden, what's African too? This is opening day. We had a large block party, potluck. And we called it the reunion on Union because this is on Union Street and because so many people that had been displaced came back and had a reason to come back for the day and come to this potluck. So this is before, this is that corner of 23rd and Union. This is after. So we had this, in the concrete living room, we had a outdoor coffee table, also made of concrete. And the coffee table was, we got historic photos from people that they love of the neighborhood, and we epoxied those images on top of the coffee table. So it was meant to kind of be literally a community coffee table. And the space went on to have a life of its own, different activities and programming and, just everyday use. So I think that's my time, but I hope that gives you a sampling of the ways in which I myself and the folks in my office are working in the kinds of places that we're talking about today. So with that, thank you for having me.
Thank you very much sharing your presentation today. It was very inspiring, and it was great to see the integration of art in your project, and you know, participatory process within your design. So I see some of questions coming into the questions. So I will let you unmute and ask questions. We can start with, I think, Dr. Diane Allen. Let me go to. Can you help me, Angela? Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Sarah. So glad to have you here. I really love your Africa Town project, Wakanda Forever. So, so my question is, I'm asking you this, I guess, because I want you to talk about it for other people. But you know, these communities and places in general have many historic, have many histories, and they have many ethnographic layers, right? So as you work, how do you choose, and when you're working with communities, especially, you know, if like the last presentation was a lot about this kind of shifting of, you know, whose place is it, right? So how do you deal with that question, and how you decide like whose history is the one that's going to go forward? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a tough one. You know, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where the you know, history of land, particularly as it relates to indigenous peoples, is so recent and so palpably conflicting with the world that has been constructed. It is a question. Now, for African Americans living in the Central District, they've lived there for 150 years. There is no race. There is no, oh, we lived here in, you know, this amount of years or whatever. But in this particular context, where really the question of displacement and gentrification started 500 years ago, that I always put that in that context. That, you know, the displacement of Black people in the West is not a question of the Central District versus moving to the suburbs. It started, you could call that a form of gentrification. And, you know, Mindy Fuller talks about this a lot, about compounded traumas, that this is a series of traumas that are related to the same underlying structures of society. And so when we talk about it like that, there's a sense of justice that's embedded in having a place, you know. And so it's not to say, you know, it's not to say that that one culture or one group of people has rights to a place over another, but there is the work of justice that I bring, and a lens of justice that I bring to working in this particular case with the African American community. So places change, though. Places do change. People move, and nothing is static. But in the context of the last 500 years of gentrification, that having a sense of place is important in relationship to that history, and that's what I'm working towards accomplishing.
Okay, next question, Omar Ali. Can you unmute yourself and ask questions?
Sure. Hi, Sarah. Very nice to see you here. I think your talk was excellent, and I think you're working on some really important ideas. Side note, is Phil Sievertson still working with you?
I just got off the phone with him right before I logged on with this.
Great. Tell him I said hi. Chicago connection.
Okay.
So I work at a firm called Urban Lab here in Chicago, and we work on a lot of similar issues, I think. And one thing we always have to tackle, and I don't think we tackle particularly well, actually, but I think you do, is how do you address the needs of the community while maintaining your agency, as an architect, as a landscape architect, but still asserting your own kind of expertise without seeming too like, coming in and like changing everything.
Does Karishma work with you?
No, it's
Oh, okay.
it's just a few of us. Sara Dunn and Martin Felston are the principals.
Oh, okay. Okay. Great question. I generally think that planning and design, since urban renewal has like shifted almost to another, well, I'll say planning more than design. Planning has shifted almost too far in the direction of giving up agency. And I think that comes from a place of guilt about urban renewal and freeways and all of the things that planners have done. And I think it's not helpful at a certain point. And so I am trying to find, if you notice, in the methods that we're using, we're not saying like, we never ask actually, what do you want? Never ask that question. But rather we ask, what do you love? Or what are your, what are the big kind of like goals and visions and priorities and things that are important to you? And we'll design around that. But not, it's not about like just completely giving up agency. It's about this, you could say call and response or a dance, or it's an interpretive framework. And so the data, the input that we get from people is not, because this is how I think of it. When I go to a community meeting, me, Sara, as a person, I'm going there to advocate for me. Like, for instance, I used to live in Seattle and I went to a light rail transit planning meeting, and I'm like, I want the stop outside my door. Okay. And that's why I came to the meeting, because I want the light rail to stop, drop me off at my front door. And that's all. And I'm professional, but I didn't come there to say like, what is the best, most efficient use of the system, and think about it from that perspective, right? Now I can. So more importantly, if I was a planner organizing that meeting, I would want to know what is important to you. Okay, most important thing to you is to have a stop in close proximity to your home. You know what I mean? And so the questions that we're asking and the methods that we're using are critical to, I think, finding the right balance between, working with the community and anchoring what you do to the way that they live, but also being able to have them leverage your expertise, and so that's kind of where we try to land basically in our work.
Yeah, great answer. I mean, I think it's so nuanced, right? Yeah, thanks very much for your talk.
Thank you. Hortense Keita.
Yes, hi. I really appreciated this presentation. It was very, very nice. And my question is about your approach, because it seems the catastrophe with Hurricane Katrina is what drove you to want to be a landscape architect. But I wanted to know what it is that drives your approach to creating solutions or making up a system. For example, going back and doing research on history or the original settlers in your first project, or how you considered the graffiti makers and writers in your third project. It just seems very humane, and I wanted to know what it is that drives your strategy. And also I wanted to know, if it's okay to ask 2 questions in a row, what it was that was your intent in making the coming soon posters, the fiction. Was it to inspire something that could happen that would resemble the fiction? Thank you.
Great. Now I've heard the first one. What was the first one?
Oh yeah, what is it that drives your
right.
strategy, like your research? And yeah.
I mean, a lot of that research has to be done, I think, because of the limitations of design and planning as we're taught it. And so it takes some retooling, and we do it through every project. To link it back to Hurricane Katrina, so the first meetings I ever attended, or my first really engagement with planning and design, was just as an interested person after Katrina, you know, and like, I don't know how many meetings I went to, but then things started to get built based on that feedback. And I was just like, wait, that's not what, I was like, that's not what I understood that was being proposed. Like, I didn't understand the drawings or what they were talking about until it got built. And I'm like, oh, that's not the thing that I thought. But also what I felt like there were a lot of well-intentioned architects and planners coming to Louisiana. And it wasn't for a lack of intention or even resources for a period. It was really a lack of, there were limits to what they were able to do. So now that I've gone to school for this and now I teach it and now I practice it, I understand clearer what those limits are. And, you know, we're very stuck on precedent, and like, that's how we literally train to design, is understanding precedents. And we're really rooted in very specific cultural and historical trajectories, and we're basically limiting ourselves in terms of what we think is possible. And we don't have the methods necessary to translate other people's ways of living into contemporary design. So a lot of that research and work, and even the engagement methods, are about trying to crack open our thinking on what's possible. Graffiti peer, you know, to be told like, don't do landscape architecture here by so many graffiti writers, they're by virtue of saying that, speaking to what we know, which is landscape architecture produces landscapes that kind of all look the same, you know, relative to what's possible. And so what is a different way of making things look? If we have to do something, and structurally we have to do something. In terms of the climate, we have to do something. In terms of urban development, this needs something. So what do? We're the ones that we claim we're the ones to call on. But so a lot of that research and engagement work is about generating other inputs and points of reference other than what we know has already been built and done and like is reproduced over and over again. And then now I forgot the second question.
Oh yes, the coming soon posters. Was it your intention? Yeah.
It was not about being literal. It's kind of a satire kind of thing on this ubiquity of this coming soon. Like, you know, it's a language, it's a visual language that is embedded in this place because of the rate of development happening there. But, you know, kind of taking that and flipping it on its head. It wasn't about being real or fictional. It's all weirdly fantastical with slight elements of reality, so that it's kind of fools the mind of, wait, but is it gonna happen? You know, I mean, it was about being 100 years from now too, and writing Black people into the future of this place. And so there was, we worked hard to get the right balance between fiction and real, and just enough to make you think, well, could this weird thing happen? You know, and from there, you know, your mind automatically starts to be like, well, okay, what would it take to make it happen? You know, and now you're halfway there towards getting involved.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is a good place to end this session. So please help me thank Sara for her wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. So we are going to have the last session, which is the panel discussion, starting at 4:10, and it will be in the same room, in this room. So please do not leave for the panel discussion, and we'll have a break about 10 minutes and see you here again.